Imagine for a moment that you are living 2,000 years ago. You are a tribal leader in the forests of Gaul, or maybe you are a British nobleman in the foggy lands across the sea, or a German prince on the huge flatlands beyond the Rhine River. Suddenly, news arrives that makes your blood run cold. The Roman soldiers are coming. For millions of people over the centuries, these words meant only one thing: the end of one world and the start of a completely different one. The story of the Roman legions is not just the story of an amazing army. It is the story of how a small city-state in Italy managed to conquer and control almost the entire known world of its time, creating an empire that lasted over 1,000 years. But to truly understand the devastating impact of these military forces, we must look into the experiences of those who faced these unstoppable war machines. When we talk about why the Roman legions were terrifying to fight, we're not just talking about military tactics or better equipment. We're exploring a historical event that completely changed the political, cultural, and social geography of entire continents. The legions weren't just soldiers. They were agents of a civilization change that swept across the ancient world like a force of nature. To begin our journey, we must first understand what exactly made the Roman legions so different from any military force that had come before. The basic difference wasn't just their weapons or armor, although these were certainly better. The true Roman advantage came from something much deeper and more organized: the way they thought about warfare, discipline, and military organization. While most ancient peoples viewed war as a series of individual battles, the Romans developed a completely different approach. For them, war was an exact science, a subject that could be studied, perfected, and used with mathematical precision. This mindset showed up in every part of their military operations, from basic recruit training to the complex movements of years-long campaigns. The average Roman legionary wasn't just a warrior. He was a military professional trained for months or even years before seeing his first real combat. While their enemies often relied on individual courage, tribal drive, or larger numbers, the Romans created a military machine based on strict discipline, standardized training, and tactics tested in hundreds of battles. Think for a moment about the training process of a legionary. From the moment a young Roman or allied soldier joined the legions, his life was completely transformed. Waking up before sunrise, marching long distances, carrying heavy equipment, training with swords and shields until movements became automatic, learning to build fortifications and operate siege weapons. This was no casual or occasional training. It was an intensive and systematic program that transformed regular people into professional soldiers. But training was only the beginning. What truly set the legions apart was their internal organization. Each legion was divided into smaller units called centuries, each commanded by an experienced centurion. These officers were not distant nobles commanding from far away. They were battle-hardened veterans who knew every man under their command and knew exactly how to use their skills on the battlefield. The legion's chain of command structure was both flexible and strictly disciplined. Each soldier knew exactly what his role was, who his superiors and subordinates were, and how his individual actions fit into the larger strategy. This clarity of command and responsibility meant that the legions could execute complex movements even in the chaos of battle, something that was almost impossible for less organized armies. Now imagine being a Celtic or German warrior facing this military machine for the first time. You're used to battles that rely on individual courage, where brave warriors charge at the enemy, shouting war chants and relying on brute strength and momentum to win. Suddenly, you find yourself facing perfectly aligned rows of Roman soldiers, each identical in equipment and posture, moving as a single giant organism. The first psychological shock came from the legion's very appearance. While most ancient armies were a mixed collection of warriors with different equipment, the legions displayed a striking uniformity. Each legionary wore the same type of armor, carried the same distinctive shield, and used the same sword. This uniformity was not just for looks. It sent a clear message about the organization, discipline, and resources of the Roman state. But the true Roman superiority was revealed when the battle began. While their enemies often launched into disorganized charges, hoping to break the Roman lines with the first impact, the legions responded with a discipline that must have seemed supernatural to those facing it for the first time. The Romans developed a battle formation that maximized their advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. The classic three-line formation allowed fresh soldiers to replace tired ones during battle, always maintaining a strong and organized front line. This ability to rotate troops during combat was completely revolutionary in ancient warfare. Think about what this meant in practice. While enemy warriors got tired after the first few minutes of intense combat, the Romans could keep their effectiveness for hours. Exhausted soldiers from the front line pulled back in an orderly way, being replaced by fresh men from the second line. This rotation continued until enemy resistance was completely broken. But perhaps even more scary than their discipline in battle was the way the legions conducted sieges. The Roman art of attacking fortified cities terrified enemies long before any battle began. When a legion approached a fortified city, it didn't just surround it and wait. It completely changed the surrounding landscape. Roman military engineers were capable of things that seemed impossible to their contemporaries. They could redirect entire rivers, build bridges over seemingly impossible gaps, and create war machines that could tear down the strongest walls. During the siege of Jerusalem, the legions built a wall around the city that was 4 miles long, effectively creating an open-air prison for its people. The Romans' ability to quickly build fortifications confused their enemies. In just a few days, a legion could transform an open field into a complex fortress complete with walls, moats, watchtowers, and even water supply systems. This ability not only protected Roman troops, but also showed their technological and organizational superiority in a visible and scary way. What made these constructions even more impressive was that they were built by the soldiers themselves. Each legionary was trained not only as a warrior, but also as a basic engineer, carpenter, and builder. This versatility meant the legions were self-sufficient in a way no other ancient army could match. But let's look deeper into the psychological aspect of facing the Roman legions. To truly understand why fighting them was so terrifying, we need to understand the mental and emotional impact their presence had on the people they faced. The legion's reputation went ahead of them, wherever they went. Stories of entire cities being destroyed, populations enslaved, and 1,000-year-old kingdoms disappearing from history spread far faster than the Roman troops themselves. This psychological warfare was as powerful a weapon as any siege weapon. Imagine being a local leader who has just received news that the legions are coming. You've heard the stories. Cities that fought back are completely destroyed. Entire populations sold into slavery. Leaders publicly executed as an example. The choice before you is clear. Resist and face complete destruction, or surrender and hope for mercy that may or may not come. This psychological pressure was calculated and deliberate. The Romans understood that war was not just about physical strength, it was also about breaking the will to resist. They built a reputation for ruthlessness that served as a weapon in itself. Cities often surrendered without a fight simply because their people had heard what happened to those who resisted. But for those brave or desperate enough to face the legions in an open field, the reality of combat was even more terrifying than the stories suggested. The experience of facing a Roman charge was something few forgot, mainly because few lived to tell the tale. Roman close-quarters tactics were devastatingly effective. The gladius, the Roman short sword, was specifically designed for close-quarters combat. While many cultures preferred long swords that needed space to swing, the gladius was a stabbing weapon that could be used effectively even in tight crowds. This difference may seem technical, but it had huge effects in battle. Roman soldiers trained constantly with their shields and swords, learning to use the shield not only as protection, but also as an offensive weapon. They could push with the shield to knock an enemy off balance, and then quickly stab with a gladius, a move that became automatic after years of training. This technique was devastatingly effective against enemies who were unprepared for it, but perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Roman legions was their relentlessness. They didn't fight with the wild passion of tribal warriors or the quest for individual glory of epic heroes. They fought with the cold efficiency of a well-oiled machine. There was no hesitation, no mercy, no pause to honor the dead or celebrate small victories. There was only the steady, unstoppable advance of the Roman military machine. This calculated coldness was more terrifying than any war cry or display of ferocity. It was the difference between facing a wild predator and a professional executioner. The predator might be distracted, tired, or satisfied with its prey. The executioner would simply continue its work until it was complete. Roman logistics was another factor that made the legions so powerful. While most ancient armies were limited by the need to return home during planting and harvest seasons, the legions were professional forces that could campaign for years at a time. They had sophisticated supply systems that could keep tens of thousands of soldiers fed, equipped, and paid even in hostile territory thousands of miles from Rome. This logistical capacity meant that legions not only won battles, they could maintain long occupations that completely broke enemy resistance. While tribal peoples could gather large armies for individual battles, they could not keep those armies in the field indefinitely. The Romans could. The Roman ability to bring conquered peoples into their military system was also revolutionary. Rather than simply destroying all local structures, the Romans often brought local warriors into their auxiliary forces, using their specialized skills while gradually Romanizing them. This policy not only increased Roman military power, but also reduced the potential for future rebellion. Think about the psychological impact of seeing your own countrymen fighting in the Roman ranks. For many ancient peoples whose identity was deeply tied to tribal or ethnic loyalty, the sight of members of their own culture serving Rome was deeply demoralizing. It sent a clear message: resistance was useless, and eventual integration into the Roman world was inevitable. Roman siege tactics deserve closer examination because it was often during long sieges that Roman superiority became most clear. A Roman siege was not simply surrounding a city and waiting. It was a complex military operation that showed all aspects of Roman superiority: engineering, organization, discipline, and ruthlessness. When a legion arrived at a fortified city, the first thing that happened was a detailed study of the defenses. Roman engineers examined the walls, found weak points, and checked water sources and supply routes. This was no casual look. It was a scientific study of the fortifications that would guide a carefully planned siege strategy. The next step was to completely isolate the city. The Romans built lines of circumvallation, walls that completely surrounded the besieged city, preventing any entry or exit. But they didn't stop there. They also built lines of contravallation, outward-facing walls that protected the besiegers from relief armies that might try to break the siege. Imagine being inside a city under Roman siege. First, you realize that all escape routes have been cut off. Then, you see the war machines being carefully built outside your walls. Siege towers that rise above your own fortifications, catapults capable of throwing man-sized stones, and battering rams that can break even the strongest gates. But perhaps most terrifying of all was Roman patience. They could keep a siege going for months, or even years if necessary. Meanwhile, inside the city, supplies were running low, disease was spreading, and morale was slowly getting worse. The defenders knew that the Romans outside were well supplied, rested, and ready to continue the siege for as long as necessary. Roman siege engineering reached levels not to be matched again for over 1,000 years. During the siege of Masada, the Romans literally moved a mountain, building a stone and earth ramp that allowed their war machines to reach a fortress that had been thought impossible to capture. This ability to overcome any natural or man-made obstacle had a devastating psychological impact on Rome's enemies. If even the most powerful fortifications couldn't stop the legions, what hope was there for any resistance? This sense of Roman inevitability was as powerful a weapon as any catapult or battering ram. Let's now look at some specific cases that show why facing the Roman legions was such a terrifying prospect. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul offers some of the most vivid examples of Roman power in action. When Caesar began his Gallic campaigns, he faced a confederation of tribes that individually were powerful warriors. The Gauls were known for their courage in battle, their skill in metalworking, and their ability to raise large armies when necessary. On paper, they should have been able to withstand the Roman legions, but Caesar consistently showed how Roman organization and discipline could overcome even larger enemy forces. At the Battle of Bibracte, he faced a confederation of Helvetii tribes totaling over 300,000 people, including some 100,000 warriors. Caesar's legions were significantly outnumbered, but their superior discipline and tactics enabled a decisive victory. What made this victory even more impressive was the way the legions responded when things got tough. At one point in the battle, the Roman forces were attacked from behind by warriors who had gotten around their lines. Instead of panicking, the legions simply turned their rear formations to meet the new threat, effectively fighting on two fronts at the same time. This tactical flexibility was something most ancient armies simply lacked. It depended on a level of training, discipline, and leadership that only the Romans had managed to develop. To the Gauls facing the legions that day, it must have seemed like they were fighting a supernatural enemy. But perhaps the most dramatic example of Roman relentlessness came during the siege of Alesia. When the Gallic leader Vercingetorix retreated to this mountaintop fortress, he likely believed he had found a position that even the Roman legions could not take. Caesar responded to this challenge with one of the most impressive displays of military engineering in ancient history. He not only surrounded Alesia with a circumvallation line, but also built a second line of fortifications facing outward, preparing for the Gallic relief army that was sure to come. When this relief army finally arrived, numbering over 50,000 warriors, Caesar found himself fighting enemies both inside and outside his lines. Any other ancient commander would likely have thought this situation hopeless, but Caesar used the Roman fortifications themselves as a weapon, forcing the Gauls to attack prepared defensive positions while his own troops fought with the advantage of fortified terrain. The result was one of the most complete victories in Roman military history. Not only was Vercingetorix captured and the relief army scattered, but organized Gallic resistance was essentially broken forever. After Alesia, there would never again be a serious Gallic revolt against Roman rule. The conquest of Britain offers another fascinating example of the legions in action, this time against a completely different kind of enemy. The Britons were known for their unconventional warfare tactics, using chariots and taking advantage of their superior knowledge of the local terrain. When the legions first landed in Britain under Julius Caesar, they faced a type of combat for which they were completely unprepared. The Britons avoided head-on battles, preferring guerrilla attacks and quick retreats. Their chariots were something new for the Romans, who initially struggled to deal with this new threat. But Roman adaptability, once again, proved decisive. Within a few campaigns, the legions had developed effective counter-tactics. They learned to use their auxiliary cavalry more effectively, developed formations that could respond quickly to chariot attacks, and began to use the Britons' own mobility against them through coordinated pursuit tactics. Most importantly, the Romans understood that victory in Britain would require more than military victories. They began a systematic campaign of building roads, fortifications, and cities that gradually transformed the British landscape. This infrastructure not only made it easier for the legions to move, but also began the process of Romanization that would eventually transform Britain into a prosperous Roman province. Emperor Trajan's conquest of Dacia represents perhaps the most extreme example of what it meant to face the Roman legions at the height of their power. The Dacians were a powerful people with a sophisticated military culture and impressive fortifications in the Carpathian Mountains. The Dacian king Decebalus had previously forced Rome to accept a humiliating treaty, paying tribute to the Dacians in exchange for peace. But when Trajan became emperor, he decided this situation was unacceptable and launched a campaign to conquer Dacia completely. The Dacian Wars showed every aspect of the Roman military machine in full operation. The legions built bridges over the Danube that were engineering marvels, marched through mountainous terrain thought impossible to cross, and conducted sieges against fortifications that had been considered impregnable. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of the Dacian Wars was the sheer scale of the Roman operation. Trajan assembled a force that included not only multiple legions but also tens of thousands of auxiliary troops, engineers, siege specialists, and a logistical infrastructure that could sustain this enormous force for years of continuous campaigning. For the Dacians, facing this military machine must have been like trying to resist a force of nature. No matter how bravely they fought or how skillfully they used the mountainous terrain to their advantage, the Romans simply kept coming, overcoming every obstacle through a combination of military discipline, superior engineering, and seemingly endless resources. The end of the Dacian Wars was typical of Roman ruthlessness. When it became clear that his cause was lost, Decebalus killed himself rather than be captured. Dacia was transformed into a Roman province, its population partially resettled, and its mineral wealth used to finance Trajan's construction projects in Rome. But to truly understand why facing the Roman legions was so terrifying, we must also think about what happened after the battles were over. Roman victory didn't simply mean military defeat. It meant the complete transformation of entire societies. The Romans developed a system for dealing with conquered territories that was both brutal and surprisingly effective. Resisting populations were often enslaved or killed, but those who submitted could eventually be brought into the Roman world as citizens. This policy created powerful reasons for submission. Local leaders who worked with Rome often found they could keep or even increase their wealth and status within the Roman system. On the other hand, those who resisted faced not only death, but the complete destruction of their way of life. The process of Romanization that followed military conquest was as impressive as the campaigns themselves. The Romans built roads connecting remote territories to the heart of the empire, established cities that served as administrative and commercial centers, and introduced Roman laws and customs that gradually replaced local traditions. This transformation was not just superficial. Within a generation or two, sons of defeated tribal chiefs often found themselves serving as officers in the Roman legions themselves, defending the empire that had conquered their ancestral lands. This capacity for assimilation was one of the most powerful weapons in the Roman arsenal. Think about the psychological impact of this transformation on the conquered populations. Not only had their armies been defeated and their fortifications destroyed, but their very cultural identity was being systematically replaced. Ancient temples were rededicated to Roman gods, tribal laws were replaced by Roman law, and local languages gradually gave way to Latin. This wasn't a temporary conquest that could be reversed once the conquerors left. It was a permanent transformation that fundamentally changed the nature of the conquered societies. For many ancient peoples, this was literally the end of their world. The economic effects of confronting the Roman legions were also devastating. Rome didn't conquer territories only for military glory. It conquered them for economic gain. Mines were opened, agricultural lands were given to Roman settlers, and taxation systems were put in place that drained local wealth to the center of the empire. This economic exploitation was conducted with the same ruthless efficiency that characterized Roman military operations. Trained administrators recorded local resources, established tax collection systems, and organized the transportation of wealth to Rome. For populations that had been self-sufficient for centuries, suddenly discovering that a large portion of their produce was being shipped to a distant city must have been deeply demoralizing. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of facing the Roman legions was the gradual realization that resistance was truly useless. No matter how bravely people fought, how skillfully they used the local terrain, or how many times they achieved local tactical victories, the Romans always returned, always with more soldiers, better equipment, and improved strategies. This inevitability of Roman conquest created a despair that went beyond the normal fear of military defeat. It was the recognition that an entire civilization was being systematically taken apart and replaced by something completely different. The revolts that occasionally broke out in conquered territories show both the desperation of the conquered peoples and the ruthlessness of the Roman response. Boudicca's revolt in Britain, for example, began as an outburst of justified anger against Roman abuses, but ended in massacre when the legions finally responded in force. During this revolt, the Britons initially achieved impressive victories, destroying Roman cities and killing thousands of colonists. For a moment it must have seemed as if Roman domination could be reversed, but when the legions regrouped under experienced command, they showed once again why facing them was so terrifying. The final battle of the revolt saw a much larger British force completely destroyed by superior Roman tactics. The Britons fought bravely, but their individual courage could not overcome the discipline and organization of the legions. The result was not only a military defeat, but the complete suppression of British resistance, so complete that there was never another serious revolt in Roman Britain. Similar stories were repeated throughout the empire. The Great Jewish Revolt that led to the destruction of Jerusalem followed a similar pattern. Initial success fueled by desperation and outrage, followed by Roman retaliation of calculated brutality that discouraged further resistance for generations. The destruction of Jerusalem by Titus's legions in 70 AD represents perhaps the most dramatic example of what it meant to arouse the fury of Roman military power. The siege lasted months, during which the city's people were reduced to eating hides and even engaging in cannibalism. When the walls were finally broken through, the destruction that followed was so complete that it permanently changed the religious and cultural geography of the ancient world. But even in these extreme situations, we can see the cold efficiency that characterized Roman military operations. The destruction of Jerusalem was not an uncontrolled massacre fueled by rage. It was a carefully executed military operation designed to send a clear message to anyone who might consider challenging Rome in the future. This combination of military efficiency and calculated brutality is what made the Roman legions so different from other ancient conquerors. Armies like those of Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan could be equally devastating, but their brutality often seemed impulsive or emotional. Roman violence was different. It was systematic, predictable, and designed to achieve specific political goals. To fully understand the terror of facing the legions, we must also think about how the Romans themselves thought about war and conquest. For them, war was not a glorious adventure or a display of individual courage. It was a political tool to achieve specific state goals. This practical mindset toward violence was deeply disturbing to cultures that viewed war in more heroic or ritualized terms. When Celtic or Germanic warriors entered battle, they often did so with elaborate rituals, war chants, and expectations of glorious individual combat. The Romans simply marched in formation and began the methodical work of killing the enemy as efficiently as possible. This difference in military mentality was reflected in every aspect of Roman operations. While many ancient cultures had rules about fighting at certain times or places, the Romans fought where and when it was tactically smart. While some people tried to minimize civilian casualties, the Romans viewed terror as a legitimate tool of war. The result was that facing the Roman legions meant confronting an enemy that didn't share their own rules for how war should be conducted. This moral and cultural difference often left Rome's enemies psychologically unprepared for the kind of conflict they would face. Roman military technology also represented a significant advantage that went far beyond simple superiority in individual weapons. The Romans developed a systematic approach to military innovation that allowed them to constantly improve their capabilities in response to new challenges. When the legions encountered a new enemy tactic or fortification type, Roman military engineers studied the problem and developed specific countermeasures. This technological adaptability meant that even enemies who initially achieved some success against the legions quickly discovered that their advantages were temporary. Consider, for example, how the Romans responded to the war elephants they faced against Pyrrhus and later Hannibal. At first, these huge creatures caused real panic in the Roman ranks, but the Romans quickly developed specific tactics for dealing with elephants, including the use of fire projectiles and formations that could direct the elephants' charges into areas where they would cause less damage. This adaptability extended to all aspects of Roman warfare. When facing Parthian mounted archers, the Romans changed their formations and equipment to better address guerrilla tactics. When they found new types of fortifications, they developed new siege engines. This ability to constantly evolve meant that defeating the legions once did not guarantee future victories. The infrastructure supporting the legions also made it extremely difficult to resist Roman power for long periods. The famous Roman roads were not just engineering marvels, they were strategic pathways that allowed the quick movement of troops and supplies across huge distances. This communications and transportation network meant that local rebellions could be quickly put down by legions arriving from other regions of the empire. Even if rebels managed to defeat local Roman forces, they knew reinforcements would be arriving within weeks or months. The Roman ability to project power across vast distances was something completely new in the ancient world. While most ancient empires were geographically limited by the difficulty of maintaining communications and supplies across long distances, the Romans created a system that could sustain military operations at the same time across multiple borders. This multi-front war capability meant that Rome's enemies could not rely on distractions elsewhere in the empire to ease pressure on themselves. The legions in Britain could continue their operations even while other legions fought on the Danube frontier or in the Middle East. The Roman conscription system also contributed to the sense of inevitability surrounding the legions. While most ancient armies relied on men who had other jobs and responsibilities, the legions were made up of professional soldiers who dedicated decades of their lives to military service. This professionalization meant that the legions maintained their skills through constant training. Even during periods of relative peace, soldiers practiced formations, construction techniques, and weapons used daily, making sure they were always combat-ready. Furthermore, the Roman veteran system meant that military knowledge and battle experience were preserved and passed down through generations. Veteran centurions who had served in multiple campaigns trained new recruits, making sure that lessons learned on one frontier were applied to all others. This institutional continuity was something few Roman enemies could match. While tribes could produce great individual warriors, they often lost military knowledge when these warriors died. The Romans, on the other hand, created a system that constantly preserved and expanded their collective military knowledge. Roman discipline extended far beyond the battlefield to include all aspects of military life. Legion camps were set up according to strict standards regardless of terrain or circumstances. This standardization meant that any legionary could find their way around any Roman camp, even if they had never served with that particular unit. This obsessive attention to detail created an operational efficiency that impressed and scared enemies. People used to disorganized armies that camped casually were amazed to see legions build elaborate fortifications every night, only to take them down the next morning. Religion also played a role in the legions' effectiveness, though in a very different way than for many of their enemies. While Celtic or Germanic warriors might fight with individual religious passion, hoping for personal glory in the afterlife, legionaries fought with a sense of collective duty to Rome and their fellow soldiers. This difference in religious motivation had important practical effects. Warriors motivated by individual glory could be extremely brave, but they could also be reckless or undisciplined. Legionnaires motivated by collective duty were more likely to follow orders even in difficult circumstances and to keep formation even when the battle was not going well. The cult of legion standards created a religious focus that reinforced military discipline. Losing a legion standard was considered one of the most terrible dishonors that could happen to a unit, creating powerful reasons for soldiers to fight fiercely, even in desperate situations. This combination of religious motivation and military discipline created a psychological strength that was difficult for enemies to understand or counter. Legionnaires fought not only for their own survival or glory, they fought for the honor of Rome and their unit, a motivation that kept them going, even when individual circumstances seemed desperate. Roman military medicine also contributed to the legion's effectiveness in ways that often went unnoticed by their enemies. The Romans developed a system of military medical care that was surprisingly advanced by ancient standards. Military hospitals were set up on permanent bases. Trained surgeons traveled with the legions on campaign, and standardized medical procedures dramatically increased the survival rates of wounded soldiers. This ability to save human lives meant that experienced veterans could return to service after injuries that would have been fatal in other armies. To enemies used to high death rates from wounds and disease, the Roman ability to keep soldiers healthy and return wounded to combat must have seemed almost supernatural. This medical advantage translated directly into a military advantage, allowing the legions to maintain their effective strength for longer periods. Roman military intelligence was another factor contributing to their superiority. The Romans developed sophisticated spy networks that gave them detailed information on potential enemies long before fighting broke out. This advanced intelligence allowed Roman commanders to plan campaigns with detailed knowledge of enemy forces, local terrain, available resources, and political dynamics. While their enemies often entered battle with limited knowledge of Roman capabilities, legion commanders typically knew exactly what they were up against. The Roman use of diplomacy as a weapon of war was also devastatingly effective. The Romans were masters at exploiting internal divisions among their enemies, offering good terms to some tribes or factions while threatening total destruction to others. This divisive diplomacy meant that few enemies could present a unified front against Rome. Even when large confederations were formed, the Romans often managed to break them apart through a combination of bribery, threats, and promises of better treatment. For local leaders facing the approaching legions, this Roman diplomacy created impossible dilemmas. Resisting risked total destruction, but working with them meant betraying allies and possibly their own culture. Many chose to work with Rome, further weakening any organized resistance. The Roman ability to learn from defeat also set them apart from many other ancient peoples. When the legions occasionally suffered setbacks, Roman commanders carefully analyzed what had gone wrong and made changes to avoid similar problems in the future. This institutional capacity for learning meant that Roman defeats were often only temporary. The disaster in the Teutoburg forest, where 3 entire legions were wiped out, was certainly a tragedy for Rome. But the Romans responded by developing new tactics for forest warfare, and eventually resumed their operations in Germania, better prepared. For enemies who achieved occasional victories against the legions, the realization that the Romans would learn from these defeats and return stronger was deeply demoralizing. It meant that even tactical victories could be strategically counterproductive if they only taught the Romans how to fight better. The Roman legion's legacy of terror extended far beyond their immediate military victories. The memory of destroyed cities, enslaved populations, and wiped out kingdoms created a reputation that went ahead of the legions wherever they went. This reputation worked as a psychological weapon that often won battles before they even began. Cities surrendered without a fight. Local leaders sought favorable terms of submission, and entire populations sometimes fled rather than face the approaching legions. The combined effect of centuries of military victories created an aura of invincibility around the legions that was nearly impossible to break. Even when individual commanders made mistakes or circumstances favored their enemies, the legion's reputation often made up for temporary tactical problems. This psychological dimension of Roman warfare is often underestimated. but it was arguably as important as any technological or organizational advantage. When enemies believed defeat was inevitable, it often became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The transformation of conquered societies also created a continuing source of power for Rome. Territories that had been conquered by military force gradually became bases of Roman power, providing soldiers, resources, and local knowledge for future conquests. This ability to transform defeated enemies into allies or citizens was one of the most distinctive features of Roman imperialism. While many conquerors simply took resources from conquered territories, the Romans created a system that gradually brought conquered peoples into the very fabric of the empire. For peoples facing Roman conquest, this meant that resistance was not only militarily difficult but also culturally complex. Resisting Rome meant resisting not just an invading army, but a system that offered pathways to wealth, status, and power within a broader imperial structure. This gradual integration created internal divisions in societies confronting Rome, with some groups seeing working with Rome as an opportunity, while others saw it as betrayal. These internal divisions often weakened military resistance before battles even began. The long-term effects of confronting the Roman legions went far beyond the immediate military consequences. The Roman conquest was not a one-time event, but the beginning of a transformative process that fundamentally changed the conquered societies over generations. Local languages were gradually replaced by Latin. Tribal legal systems gave way to Roman law, and traditional political structures were brought into imperial administration. This transformation was so complete that within a few generations, the conquered societies became recognizably Roman in many fundamental ways. To truly understand why facing the Roman legions was so terrifying, we must recognize that they represented much more than a superior military force. They were agents of a civilization system that completely transformed everything it touched. This transformation wasn't necessarily bad for everyone involved. Many people in conquered territories eventually benefited from Roman peace, improved infrastructure, expanded trade opportunities, and access to advanced technologies. But for those who valued ancestral traditions, cultural independence, or tribal political structures, the Roman conquest literally represented the end of their world. The efficiency with which this transformation process happened was in itself a source of terror. It wasn't simply that the legions defeated enemy armies. It was that they started irreversible processes that permanently changed the nature of the societies they conquered. In conclusion, facing the Roman legions was terrifying not only because of their tactical military superiority, although that was certainly impressive. It was terrifying because it represented a confrontation with a fundamentally different and seemingly unstoppable military, political, and cultural system. The legions combined professional discipline, superior technology, sophisticated organization, effective intelligence, manipulative diplomacy, and a relentless capacity for adaptation and learning. Most importantly, they operated as part of a larger system that could sustain military operations for decades, bring conquered territories into the empire, and transform defeated enemies into parts of Roman power itself. For the millions of people who lived during Rome's expansion, the legions represented a historic force that was reshaping the known world. Resistance was brave, but often useless. Working with Rome offered opportunities, but at the cost of traditional cultural identity. Either way, meeting the Roman legions marked the end of one era and the beginning of a completely different one. The fall of countless kingdoms to the Roman legions was not simply the result of Roman military superiority. Although this was crucial, it was the result of a clash between civilization systems where one side had developed forms of social, military, and political organization that were simply more effective at projecting and maintaining power on a large scale. The legacy of this confrontation still echoes throughout history. The languages we speak, the legal systems that govern us, the architecture of our cities, and even our basic ideas of government and citizenship were all influenced by the processes started by the conquests of the Roman legions over 2,000 years ago. To understand why facing the Roman legions was so terrifying is therefore to understand one of the most transformative moments in human history, when the ancient world was permanently changed by the disciplined marches of sandal-wearing soldiers carrying rectangular shields. To those who lived through this transformation, it must have seemed as if they were witnessing not just political change, but the very reshaping of human reality. As we think about this amazing journey through Roman military history, we are reminded that even the most powerful and seemingly unbeatable empires are part of a greater plan that goes beyond human understanding. The Lord God, in His infinite wisdom, allowed these historical forces to shape the world in ways that paved the way for future developments in human history. The roads built by the legions would become the routes by which new ideas and beliefs would spread throughout the known world. The empire created by the force of Roman arms would create the conditions for spiritual and cultural transformations that would forever change the course of human civilization. So as we think about the terrible power of the Roman legions and their devastating impact on countless kingdoms and peoples, we are humbly reminded that all earthly strength, however impressive, exists within a larger context of divine purpose and eternal providence.